When I saw a shape wobbling through the morning fog, my chest locked up because I understood it hadn't come here by accident. I'd driven to the old Moose Creek cabin the night before, planning nothing more heroic than patching its leaking roof and hiding from people for a while. After 40 years as a backcountry ranger, retirement felt too loud. The cabin felt silent in the best possible way. Just me, a thermos of coffee, and the high hush of the Rockies. Dawn spread a thin pearl light across the clearing. I stepped onto the sagging porch boards to test the weather and nearly kicked over my toolbox. That's when the fog opened, and there he was. At first I thought he was a grouse. Small, hunched, mottled brown. Then the sunlight nicked one feather and flashed the dark bronze only golden eagles wear. An eaglet no bigger than a house cat, dragging a wing at a helpless angle. He should have bolted. A wounded bird's first law is flee or die. But he didn't budge. He tilted his head, bright eyes locked on mine, as if I were the thing he'd come looking for. I took a step, he took 1-2 toward me. Another step, again he matched me, pausing only to steady the useless wing with his beak. By the time we met in the middle of the clearing, my pulse was rattling like hail on a tin roof. I crouched, palms open. Easy, little fella. His talons clicked once on the grass, but the stare never wavered. No hiss, no flap, no retreat. I slipped my hands around his body, feeling the frantic hammer of his heart, and carried him across the porch threshold. Inside smelled of pine, dust, and stove smoke. I lined an old fruit crate with my jacket and eased him in. He settled, let out a breathy kick that sounded almost relieved. That startled me more than the wound. A wild eagle chick trusting a human? That doesn't happen. I trimmed a strip off my flannel sleeve and jury-rigged a sling to brace the broken wing. He watched every move, eyes bright, unblinking, as though memorizing me. No panic, no fight, just patient concentration, the way a person watches a doctor thread stitches. He didn't beg, I kept telling myself while rummaging for water. He asked without a sound. And the water trembled in the cup because my hands finally started to shake. I found half a trout I'd smoked the week before. Broke it into strips. He accepted the first bite from my fingers, swallowed, then looked up as if to say that's good, but there's something else you need to see. I laughed at the thought, felt foolish, then laughed again because that gaze was so direct I could almost hear a voice behind it. By noon I'd forgotten the roof and every plan I'd carried in. All that mattered was the tiny rise and fall of feathers in the crate and the clock tick of talons on cedar when he shifted position. Outside, the fog lifted into blue sky, but the cabin stayed dim, its windows smeared with years of dust. I leaned against the doorframe, bone-tired, oddly peaceful. 3 hours later, a branch cracked somewhere near the tree line. The eaglet lifted his head sharply, eyes fixed on the doorway. I edged to the window but saw nothing, only sunlight sliding across rust-red pine trunks. The forest was breathing, listening. Something else was out there. The eaglet knew. And his calmness, his utter certainty, sent an unexpected chill up my neck. Night lowered early in the valley. I fed him again, set a lantern on the floor, and stretched out in my sleeping bag a few feet away. Every time the wind stirred, he answered with that soft kick, low and even. Not fear. A signal. Like he was calling coordinates in a language older than the cabin, older than me. Around midnight I woke to silence so complete it rang. The lantern had burned out. Moonlight painted the walls silver. The eaglet sat upright in the crate, staring at the door. I followed his gaze and for a heartbeat thought the shadows were moving. But nothing crossed the threshold, nothing breathed but us. Yet the boy inside me, the one who once believed the woods could speak, heard something pacing just beyond the line where lamplight would have ended. I almost opened the door right then. But the eaglet blinked, slow and certain, and I felt a wordless warning, not yet. Dawn bled pink over the ridge. I brewed coffee, he preened his feathers with meticulous care, and an idea settled on me heavier than the mountains themselves. Maybe I hadn't rescued him at all. Maybe I'd been summoned. The sun climbed, bright and innocent, and I caught myself smiling. Ridiculous, right? A man hauled out of retirement by a bird barely old enough to fly. I shook my head, tightening the last knot on his wing brace. You'll be back in the sky before you know it, partner. He cocked that same wise angle. And for the first time in years I felt like someone believed every promise I made. I stepped outside to fetch fresh water. The clearing sat quiet, almost expectant. The forest edge was darker than I remembered, as though keeping a secret in its pockets. I glanced over my shoulder at the open cabin door and that little figure in the crate. The distance between us suddenly felt fragile as glass. I thought that was the end of it, just a simple act of kindness for a hurt fledgling. I had no idea whom he would bring to my door. He never asked for help. He looked at me as if he already knew I would understand. The eaglet spent that first night tucked inside the fruit crate, wrapped in my flannel like a child in borrowed blankets. He drank in slow, greedy sips whenever I tipped the cup to his beak, then sagged against the boards, each breath rattling as if the whole mountain sat on his chest. I lay 2 yards away, boots still on, listening to the wet scrape of his lungs and wondering how many miles of sky he'd already lost. Around midnight, the cabin settled, old logs giving that tired sigh houses make when they remember who built them, and something new stirred outside. A muffled thump. Then another, heavier, like a bowling ball, rolled across pine needles. I killed the lantern and held my own breath. The steps circled once, slow and deliberate, then drifted off toward the timberline. No grunt, no snarl, just weight moving through darkness with purpose. Morning cracked bright and cold. When I opened the door, the world smelled of river. There on the threshold lay a fresh-cut rainbow trout, thick as my forearm, still beaded with water. I hadn't fished. No neighbor lives within 20 miles. Hawks don't leave tribute and coyotes never share. I stared until the coffee in my mug went lukewarm, then carried the fish inside, split it, and fed the eaglet small flakes of pink flesh. He gulped them, feathers trembling, but his eyes kept skating to the doorway as if checking whether his courier had arrived for a tip. That afternoon he tried to stand. The sling held, yet his legs tremored like saplings in wind. When I laid him back down, he threw his head toward the open window and loosed a sharp, rising kick, once, twice, 3 times, each note climbing a step higher, echoing between the ridges. Not distress. A summons. I felt it in my ribs the way a struck bell hums long after the mallet lifts. Dusk bled across the clearing. I hammered a loose shingle, but every swing of the hammer felt smaller than the sound clinging to those trees. Somewhere out there, something was listening, returning the signal maybe too soft for human ears. The second night, the footsteps came earlier. Same slow wait, but now they paused by the porch boards. I eased the rifle from its rack, heart thumping like it wanted out. The steps resumed, once around the walls, then vanished. The eaglet didn't startle. He lifted his head, cocked it, and let one soft chirp float into the dark, almost conversational. I sat awake till dawn, gun across my knees, wondering why I suddenly felt like the least knowledgeable creature in the valley. At first light, I found a second trout, bigger, bright silver, no tooth marks. I cleaned it on the chopping stump while ravens shot me suspicious glances as if I'd stolen their offering. The eaglet ate until his crop bulged, then leaned back and released a single high-pitched cry so pure it felt carved out of crystal. The forest answered with silence so deep it had to be full of meaning. On the third evening, storm clouds bruised the sky purple. I brought in extra firewood, settled the eaglet, and had just latched the door when the night itself seemed to step forward. A shape materialized at the edge of the porch, tall, lean, fur-black as burnt cedar, moonlight combed through with one narrow slash of white along the jaw. A wolf. He didn't growl. Didn't bare teeth. He simply stood, weight-balanced, yellow eyes glowing like tiny campfires. My pulse hammered, every ranger instinct screamed predator. I raised the rifle halfway, then noticed his gaze wasn't on me at all. It cut past my shoulder, straight to the crate where the eaglet waited. The bird answered with a low, steady chirr. The wolf's ears twitched, not back in threat but forward, as though catching a familiar voice on the wind. I could have sworn recognition flickered there, something older than fear, older than the hunt. I cleared my throat, a sound far braver than I felt. Easy, boy. The barrel wavered. The wolf blinked, slow, deliberate. Then, with the grace of falling snow, he folded his legs and sat on the top step. And waited. Minutes dragged like hours. Rain started, soft needles on the cedar roof. I could smell his coat, wild sage, and river mud. The eaglet shuffled in the crate, never looking away. My arm ached from holding the rifle. I lowered it, breath hitching. I figured a hungry killer had come. But he just sat and waited. The cabin filled with a hum I can't describe, some invisible thread stretched between predator and fledgling, vibrating with memory. The wolf looked not at me, at the eaglet. There was something human in that gaze. Thunder rolled over the ridge. The lantern guttered once, then steadied. Outside, the wolf stayed motionless, sentinel in the storm. Inside, the eaglet's eyes gleamed, not with fear, but with the calm assurance of someone who's finally been found. The wolf came back the very next night, slipping out of the timber like a shadow given its own heartbeat. Same place on the porch. Same polite silence. He sat, watched the eaglet until dawn pearl gray spilled behind the peaks, then melted into the trees when the first chickadees started bragging about daylight. I barely slept, waiting for teeth that never flashed. The second night he returned again, paws silent on wet pine needles. No growl, no hunger in his stance. He parked himself 3 steps from the door. Nothing else on earth could have pried him from that post. The eaglet answered with a quiet trill so soft I felt it more in my ribs than in my ears. On the third night, the wolf carried something in his jaws. Not a rabbit. Not a bone. A bundle of green, mountain sweetgrass, stems still damp with creek water. He padded up, laid the offering square on the threshold, and backed off to his usual watch spot. I knelt, dumbfounded. Sweetgrass is medicine up here. Eagles nibble it for stomach ache. Old trappers chew it to clear the lungs. Had he scavenged it? No, the roots were clean, the cut fresh, as if he'd chosen the stalks with care. I set 2 stalks in the eaglet's crate. The bird snapped them up, swallowing in neat gulps, then leaned into the corner as if the ache inside him had eased a notch. My jaw floated somewhere down near my boots. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of the eaglet feeding. That was all, just that tiny, satisfied rustle, yet it brought a calm to his eyes, the way a father settles when a lullaby finally works. Night after night the pattern repeated. Sometimes he arrived with more sweetgrass, sometimes with tufts of yarrow or strips of moist moss the color of emeralds. Not once did he ask for anything in return. He kept to a respectful distance, head high, nose testing the air, shoulders loose but coiled, ready to spring at anything that might threaten the fragile life behind my door. I started leaving the cabin lamp dark, sitting in the gloom where he couldn't see my face clearly, just to watch him through the cracked boards. His body was a map of scars, old knife of a gash along the flank, heel bite mark on the ear. A survivor, no question. Yet the way he settled into guard duty, quiet, deliberate, wasn't predator, wasn't curiosity. It was purpose. One evening an owl swooped low over the porch. The wolf lunged, not to kill but to herd the bird off course, then trotted back to his post without a sound. Another time a porcupine waddled too near. He circled, chuffed once, drove it away, returned to stillness. Every move said, nothing touches the eaglet. I tried reasoning it out. Maybe he'd lost his own pack, imprinted on the eagle's cry. Maybe the scent of blood triggered something strange in his brain. Maybe my favorite theory at 2 in the morning, he was the grown pup I'd saved all those years ago, paying an impossible debt. Each idea felt too small, like pulling a blanket corner over a storm. And always that question looped back, who are you, old boy? Why stay? On the 7th night, I eased onto the stoop while he was there, coffee steaming in my hand. He tensed but didn't rise. Moonlight threw silver bars across his muzzle. I spoke low, like greeting an armed stranger at your gate. You didn't come for me, did you? He blinked, slow, deliberate. My words came out a whisper. You came for him. The wolf's tail thumped once, dusty pine needles puffing. Confirmation? Coincidence? My heart believed the first option long before my head permitted it. At dawn he disappeared again, but something in the clearing felt newly stitched, threads binding wolf, man, and eaglet into one improbable fabric. I cleaned the crate, checked the sling, offered more water. The eaglet's breathing had smoothed almost to normal. The light in his eyes looked brighter than the sunrise itself. Standing there, I felt the size of what was happening tower over me. A wild wolf feeding medicine to an injured eagle chick, keeping watch all night like a veteran sentry. I'd cataloged thousands of animal behaviors in my ranger logs, but this belonged in no book. I thought it was just a free quirk of nature. But the truth ran deeper, like a river under ice. He didn't come for food. He came for him. I spent the next morning sawing rotten rafters, but every scrape of the blade kept dragging up the same memory, one I hadn't touched in 2 decades. 20 years back, before retirement and bad knees, I'd been called to a logging road just north of here. A pair of weekend hunters had cornered a wolf pup under a culvert, claimed it was disease-ridden vermin, and meant to finish the job with A.30-06. The pup couldn't have weighed 20 pounds, all legs and ears, coal-black except for a thin milk-white dash under the jaw, like a careless smear of paint. I talked the men down, wrapped the pup in my coat, and drove through the night to release him on the far side of Winter Ridge, far enough, I'd hoped, that no rifle report would ever reach him again. I watched him limp into the trees, turned the truck around, and told myself a ranger's good deed ends the moment the taillights fade. I hadn't thought about that drive in years until this wolf started showing up at my porch. Could it possibly be him? My brain shook its head. Wolves in the wild live 8, maybe 10, sometimes 12 if the winters are merciful. 20 is fantasy. Besides, the pup had been jet black all over, a glossy chunk of midnight. This one wore a distinct ivory streak along his lower jaw, a badge he carried like rank. Different animal. Had to be. But my heart kept whispering traitorous questions. That first night on the porch, I'd spotted a faint scar on the wolf's left flank, the same spot where the pup had taken a hunter's ricochet. And those eyes, liquid amber, unafraid, felt like déjà vu every time they fixed on me. Doubt climbed my spine and nested there, warm and persistent. That evening he arrived earlier than usual, stepping from the pines while the sun still tangled in the branches. No herbs carried tonight, no trout, just himself. He halted at the bottom step as always, but when I eased onto the stoop, he didn't retreat. I set the coffee mug aside, palms visible, voice low. "You remember me, don't you?" The words sounded ridiculous in open air. He took one deliberate pace forward, timber creaking under his weight, until only 2 yards separated us. His nostrils fluttered, tasting the space between man and beast. I swear the clearing tilted, the rest of the world slid off somewhere beyond the tree line. Close up, the white slash under his jaw glowed like moon on snow. My pulse jumped. The pup smear had been smaller, but right there, same angle. I reached without thinking, slow, stopping inches from his muzzle. He didn't flinch. Instead, he met my gaze the way old friends sometimes do when words have become unnecessary. And in that moment, every neatly labeled fact in my head, lifespan, coat color, common sense, crumbled under a single impossible certainty: it's him. Wind rattled the cedars. The eaglet, tucked in his crate just inside the door, chirred once, soft, trusting. The wolf's ear flicked toward the sound, then back to me. He hadn't come for scraps, hadn't come to scavenge. He'd come to stand guard for the bird and somehow for me. Can an animal remember a face after 20 winters? Science says no. But science has never knelt on a porch at dusk while a wild wolf reads your soul like Braille. I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I was holding. "You grew tall, old boy." My voice cracked like a sapling in frost. From habit more than need, I motioned toward the water pan I'd left near the steps. He ignored it, attention fixed on my eyes as though searching for the ranger who once freed him from a culvert. He looked at me as if I were one of his own. I don't know how long we stayed locked in that quiet vow. The mountains faded to silhouettes, bats stitched the first stars across the sky. At length he turned, padded back down the steps, and melted into the shadows, the clearing swallowing him without a sound. I stood there long after he vanished, hands trembling like green twigs, while the night pressed close, thick with wonder and questions too large for language. If he hadn't come back the next night, I might have chalked the whole thing up to frontier loneliness and moonlit imagination. But the next night was waiting to prove me wrong. The 5th night started like the others, waxing moon, hush of pines, but the wolf crossed a line he'd never crossed before. Instead of planting himself on the bottom step, he padded all the way up and curled right across the threshold, big shoulders wedged against the jamb. One heavy sigh, paws crossed, chin on them like an old farm dog. He wasn't visiting anymore, he'd declared residency. I sat on the floorboards a few feet inside, the eaglet dozing in his crate between us. The cabin lantern burned low, throwing gold bands over fur and feathers alike. My pulse steadied for the first time in days. Whatever storm had tied us together, it felt, for one fragile hour, like the world had finally quit spinning. Around midnight a high, needling howl sliced the stillness. Then another, closer. Coyotes plural, restless, hungry. The wolf's head snapped up, mine did too. I set the lantern on a crate lid and reached for the old Winchester I kept propped by the doorframe. The barrel felt cold, alien, almost embarrassing when laid alongside the calm certainty in his eyes. The coyotes sang again, maybe 200 yards out, threading through the timber where moonlight never touched. Shadows moved between shadows. I pumped around into the chamber. The clack echoed louder than any howl. The eaglet stirred, clicking his beak, the sound tiny but brave. The wolf rose, muscles rolling under the dark pelt, and stepped off the porch, no snarl, no show of teeth. He stopped 10 paces out, planted himself square between the cabin and the tree line, tail low, ears forward. A lone sentry on the edge of empire. Another yip burst from the brush, closer this time, testing. The wolf answered with a single chest-deep bark so forceful I felt it in the soles of my feet. Silence. Then rustle, figures pacing just beyond sight, gauging odds. Coyotes aren't foolish, they're opportunists. A wounded eagle chick smells as good as steak to them. But the posture of that wolf, head high, body still, spoke a language every scavenger understands. Try it and bleed. Minutes stretched tight as wire. I kept the rifle trained where shadows thickened, breath measured, heart rioting. The coyotes flirted with the clearing's edge, whined low, shuffled dry needles, then, one by one, the sounds unraveled into distance. Their chorus retreated up valley, swallowed by the ridges. Only when the last echo died did the wolf turn. He glanced at me not long, just enough, and padded back to the porch. Instead of lying down, he stepped inside, 3 cautious pawfalls over the threshold, and sat beside the crate. The eaglet peered up, offered a soft, throaty chirr. The wolf chuffed once, like a father saying, "Hush now, storm's past." I lowered the rifle, lungs deflating, throat hot with something that wasn't fear anymore. He'd risked his hide for the bird. Or, my mind finally dared the thought, for me too. He risked himself for him. Or for me. Dawn bled pale rose through the window slats. The wolf was gone, left without a sound, leaving only the faint heat his body had pressed into the boards. I knelt to check the eaglet, expecting the usual sluggish lift of his chest. Instead, I found him standing, wobbling on stubby talons, slinged wing twitching at the shoulder joint. He gave a startled hop, flapped once, and managed a crooked half-inch rise before wobbling back into the crate. The breath I loosed fogged the air like church incense. I rocked back on my heels, laughing and near tears at the same time. The bird's blood was moving, life pushing outward again. And part of me knew it wasn't just the stitches or the herbs. Something about the wolf's watch had carried weight medicine alone cannot measure. I stepped outside, exhaustion and triumph wrestling in my chest. The clearing looked ordinary, the kind of ordinary that disguises miracles. Not a single paw print lingered in the damp soil, only my own boots and a faint scuff where he'd braced to face the coyotes. As if he'd never been there at all. I figured that was the finale, the eagle safe, the coyotes gone, the guardian's duty honored. Thought they'd won, end of tale. But the wolf hadn't shown me the most important thing yet. Morning broke bright as hammered brass, and the eaglet decided today was the day he'd beat gravity. He crawled out of the crate, talons scraping for purchase, lifted the half-mended wing and pumped, once, twice, feathers slapping air like wet canvas. For half a breath he hovered a finger's width above the floorboard. Then the broken pinion faltered and he tumbled sideways in a flurry of dust and small, furious chirps. I rushed forward, hands outstretched, but he shook me off, dignity wounded deeper than bone. He hobbled to the threshold, stared at the empty clearing as if daring the sky to come closer next time. My chest ached watching that fierce spark trapped inside a body not yet ready. The wolf had spent the night head on paws, amber eyes half closed, listening to every wing beat like a nurse counting heartbeats. At sunrise he rose, gave the eaglet a soft rumble that sounded oddly like encouragement, and trotted into the timber without a backward glance. First time he'd left before dawn. I told myself he was hunting breakfast. But the sun slid west, shadows stretched thin, and dusk settled with no sign of him. One night bled into the next, still no paw prints, no bright eyes at the porch. The clearing felt suddenly enormous, a stage missing its lead actor. The eaglet called 3, 4, 5 times into the dark, high, piercing whistles meant for ridgelines to carry. Only the canyon wind answered back. On the second day, just after noon, the forest exhaled a sound I'd never heard, a low thunder of wings, deep and certain, a heartbeat turned inside out. An adult golden eagle swept over the trees, body longer than my arm's pan, primary spread wide as barn doors. The bird circled once, sunlight striking bronze sparks off each feather, then folded its sails and dropped into the clearing. I froze halfway to the water barrel, every sense lit up like fuses. The adult touched down 6 feet from the eaglet, talons knitting the earth, head tilted in regal inspection. The eaglet chirred 3 staccato notes I'd come to recognize as greeting. The adult answered with a single, resonant click of its beak, the sound of flint striking steel. They knew each other. Somehow, impossibly, they knew. Before my brain could catch up, a dark figure eased from the tree line, my wolf, padding slow, eyes on the 2 birds. He came no closer, only sat, chest heaving from what must have been a hard run across valleys I couldn't name. His gaze flicked to me just long enough to pin my heart in place, then returned to his charges. "How did you find him?" The words scraped out, half prayer, half accusation. "How did you know?" The wolf said nothing, he'd already delivered his answer in feathers and living proof. The adult stepped forward, nudged the eaglet's sling with that lethal beak, testing strength. The eaglet braced, lifted both wings, one steady, one trembling, while the larger bird spread its own in a slow, deliberate fan, a lesson without words. This is what tomorrow looks like. The eaglet mirrored the motion as best he could. My throat tightened until breathing felt optional. Minutes passed, maybe hours, time puddled between wing beats. Eventually the adult hopped to the porch rail and settled, sentinel and teacher all at once. The wolf curled at the bottom step, tail covering his paws, gaze softening into something that looked dangerously like pride. I swear the air itself thickened with meaning, as though the valley had been waiting its whole life for this exact alignment of claw and paw and humbled man. I inched backward into the cabin, afraid a single wrong sound might snap the spell. The eaglet didn't notice, every atom of him pointed toward the larger bird. Guidance flowed between them in a language older than weather. And over it all loomed that single impossible question looping in my skull. How could a wolf track down an eagle across mountain ranges? How had he known which cry in the sky belonged to this chick? By sunset the adult launched skyward, a bronze flare against indigo, circled twice, and vanished beyond the ridge. The wolf rose, gave the eaglet one last measuring look as if confirming the lesson had taken, then melted into the timber the same way night slips into a room when you blow the lamp out. I stood alone on the porch, knees weak, soul roaring. I had thought rescuing a crippled bird and befriending a lone wolf was the ceiling of wonder. I thought I had seen everything, but nature was only beginning to show me the truth. Dawn pried the night open with a single golden blade, and the eaglet answered. He hopped from the crate to the porch rail, first time he'd dared that height, balanced, shook his feathers into place, and looked straight at the wolf as if asking permission. The wolf gave nothing more than a calm blink, but something in the set of his ears said now. The eaglet crouched, pumped both wings. Cloth sling fluttered, feathers hissed. He rose a foot, wobbled, came down hard. I lurched forward, then forced myself still. Too much help and he'd never leave. He tried again. This time he cleared a yard, hung there, body trembling like a compass needle caught between north and destiny. Air bucked beneath him, he fought it, climbed another foot. 2 full meters of impossible. My lungs forgot the sequence for breathing. The wolf stayed planted at the bottom step, amber eyes reflective as creek water, recording every heartbeat of ascent. I felt his tension more than saw it, muscles poised, yet utterly silent, the way a priest watches a baptism. The eaglet flailed once, talons clawing at nothing, balance slipping. A cry ripped from his throat, sharp, panicked. Before gravity could claim him, a shadow thundered overhead. The adult eagle, bronze and immaculate, dropped from the blue like a blessing, wings spread to catch the fledgling on a cushion of wind. One powerful downdraft steadied the youngster, another lifted both birds together in a spiral of sunlight and whirling down feathers. They climbed above the treetops, circling, the larger bird adjusting angles so the smaller could feel each contour of the wind. Higher, over the ridge where morning burned the snowcaps pink. My eyes stung, partly from looking into the glare, mostly from the surge of something too wide for words. Beside me, the wolf never shifted. He tracked them across the sky until they were 2 sparks flickering against the raw blue, until even those sparks vanished beyond the tallest peak. Only then did his ears relax, sliding back in what looked unmistakably like contentment. I finally exhaled, the sound shaking loose from somewhere below my ribs. "You did it," I whispered, not sure if I meant the bird, the wolf, or some larger grace binding the two. He flicked an ear at my voice but kept his gaze pinned to the last place the eagles had glimmered. I followed the line of his sight. Empty sky, roaring with absence, and felt a swell of gratitude so fierce it bordered on pain. I saw how he looked at the heavens, and in that look there was happiness. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The wolf stood as though carved from the same basalt as the peaks. I waited beside him, afraid any motion might crack the china-thin hush holding the world together. Finally he turned, padded down the steps, and paused at the edge of the clearing. Muscles bunched as if he were deciding between directions written in a language only mountains read. I thought that was the curtain drop, guardian released, story wrapped. I thought, well, that's the end of it. But he came back. 2 sunsets later, I was splitting kindling when the forest doorway opened and the wolf trotted into the light. No herbs, no trout. He carried only himself and something new in his posture. A looseness, almost playful. He stopped 6 feet away, lowered his head in a small, deliberate nod. Not subservience. Acknowledgement. The kind travelers trade when their roads finally diverge. I set the hatchet down, step hesitant. "You checking on me, old friend?" My voice cracked. He blinked, slow, that familiar gesture of understanding. Then swung toward the timber, tail swishing once like a final brushstroke on a finished painting. This time he didn't look back. Branches parted around him, swallowed black fur, and the forest closed silent as a secret. I stood alone, wind tugging my sleeves, heart loud enough to scare birds from a mile away. Above the ridge, two distant specks traced lazy loops against the horizon. Bronze tethered to bronze, apprentice following master's invisible script. I raised a hand in reflex, as if they could see, as if waving might matter. Maybe it did. I gathered the broken sling from the porch rail and folded it into my pocket. The cabin felt enormous without feathers rustling in the corner, without soft paws settling at the threshold. But the emptiness wasn't loss. It was a room newly prepared for whatever mystery chose to visit next. Because now I knew, the wild keeps its own ledgers. Debts carry across seasons, across species, across decades. And sometimes, if you're very quiet, you get to watch one small line balanced in full, right in your own front yard. I turned toward the tool shed, mind already rehearsing repairs that suddenly seemed less urgent than before. The mountains breathed, the sky opened wide, and somewhere beyond the ridge an eaglet rode the wind he'd been born to claim, while a lone wolf, miles below, padded beneath the pines content to walk the world a shade lighter. The clearing stayed empty for 2 full dawns. No black silhouette against the tree line, no soft pant of breath outside the threshold. The hush felt heavier than any howl. I kept scanning the ridge anyway, telling myself he'd earned the right to disappear. Still, the cabin boards creaked with a loneliness I hadn't felt since the day I first locked its door 20 years ago. On the 3rd morning I stepped out early, coffee steaming white in the chill. A thin fog clung to the grass. My boot hit something metallic, small, solid, half buried in needles. I knelt, brushed aside dew-wet duff, and the world narrowed to a single glint of steel. A folding knife, staghorn handle worn smooth, brass bolsters dulled by time. Across the butt plate a faint engraving caught the light. JT. Keep the faith. My initials. A gift from my father the year I took the Ranger oath. I'd lost it 2 decades earlier on the far side of Winter Ridge. The same night I'd carried a half-dead wolf pup wrapped in my coat. I remember searching frantically in the beam of a flashlight, cursing the darkness, finally giving up when dawn pinked the granite. That knife had lain somewhere in those woods all this time, or so I believed until it winked at me from my own doorstep. I turned it over, throat tightening. Sap still filmed the hinge, pine resin so fresh it hadn't hardened. Someone or something had unearthed it recently, and walked who knows how many ridges to place it here, precisely where my foot would find it. He remembered. The realization hit harder than any rifle recoil. Only one creature knew both the knife and this porch. The pup I'd freed, now grown into the guardian who watched an eaglet heal. My knees gave, dropping me to the step. Fog beaded on my lashes while the knife blurred in my palm. All those nights he'd sat silent, nose lifted, ears swiveling to the eaglet's rasping wings. He'd also been weighing a debt none of us had known remained unpaid. And when the bird was safe, when the sky had reclaimed its own, he trekked back to the place of our first meeting, found the shard of metal I'd mourned and carried it home across ravines and talus fields. Wolves cache food, not keepsakes. But this wasn't for him. It was currency in a ledger older than language. I wiped the blade on my sleeve, opened it, the action still buttersmooth, and then closed it with a snap that echoed like a heartbeat. "Thank you," I whispered into the fog, unsure which direction carried my words to the right ears. A squirrel scolded overhead. A jay flashed blue between trees. Otherwise, silence. No paw prints in the damp soil, no tuft of black fur snagged on bark. The wilderness keeps its secrets clean. I slipped the knife into my pocket, weight warm against the thigh, and felt something settle in my chest, not closure exactly, but an exquisite fullness, like the moment a long-held note resolves into harmony. They remember. And they repay. I stood there until the sun shook the last shreds of mist off the spruce needles. Work waited, roof planks to nail, water barrels to patch, but the usual urgency was gone. Every tick of the clock felt like borrowed grace. That evening I built a small fire in the yard, laid a strip of smoked venison beside it. Not bait, an offering of gratitude given back. I sat until the flames guttered down to ember. No eyes flashed from the dark. The meat cooled. I left it anyway. Inside, the cabin loomed quiet but no longer lonely. The crate sat folded in the corner, feathers swept away, sling washed and hung like a retired medal. I placed the knife on the windowsill where moonlight could polish the brass, then climbed into my bunk and let sleep take me under like a gentle tide. I thought that was the final chapter, debt settled, circle closed. But just before dawn I woke, stepped onto the porch and looked up. High above the valley, 2 eagles rode a spiral of pink dawn light, one broad-winged and regal, one smaller, steadier with every stroke. And far below, at the shadowed edge of the meadow, a lone black figure stood, head tipped skyward, watching his proteges stitch the clouds. I raised a hand, heart rattling against bone. He turned, met my gaze across the silver grass, and in that instant the distance between man and wolf collapsed into silent understanding. Then he slipped back into the timber, leaving only the echo of his gratitude stamped across an endless sky. They remember. And they give thanks. When the calendar tipped past 4 silent weeks, I almost convinced myself the valley had closed the ledger for good. The roof was fixed, the woodpile high, and the knife sat on the sill like a keepsake from some wilder life. But every morning I still angled my coffee toward the empty sky, hoping for bronze wings against the slate-blue peaks and trying to ignore how much hope hurt. The 5th Sunday dawned cloudless, air so clean it felt new-minted. I stepped outside and the world held its breath, even the creek seemed to hush its chatter. Then a shadow rippled across the clearing, broad, steady, unmistakable. A full-grown golden eagle coasted down the valley and, with a single majestic sweep, settled on the peak of my cabin roof. Wood creaked under talons, sunlight struck his feathers, turning each filament to hammered copper. He didn't call, didn't shift. He just looked, down the slope of shingles, through the curl of smoke from my chimney, straight into my eyes. I froze on the porch step, heartbeat ticking loud enough to measure time. I'd seen wildlife stare before, challenge, curiosity, fear, but never whatever poured out of that gaze. It was closer to recognition, as if we shared a memory etched deeper than instincts could explain. Minutes stretched thin as fishing line. I should have felt small under that raptor's royalty. Instead, an odd calm flooded my chest. I managed a whisper. "You made it, kid." The eagle's head tilted at the sound of my voice, and the sun caught the faint scar where a sling once rubbed his shoulder. Same bird. No question. I thought he might launch right then, but instead he ducked, spread his wings half open, the motion slow, ceremonial, before folding them tight again. A gesture so deliberate it felt like a bow. My throat closed. Gratitude, plain as daylight, beamed from a creature that owed me nothing. The wind rustled through the aspens, carrying the hush of a chapel. He held the lock of that gaze a moment longer, then beat his wings once, twice, lifted clear of the roof in a flurry of glittering bronze, and arrowed upward above the treetops where the valley's silence finally cracked into the wild exclamation of his cry. It echoed off granite in 3 bright notes, then faded into the ceiling of the sky. I watched until the last fleck vanished against the sun. Only then did I notice the weight of stillness gathering at the tree line. A shape stepped from the pines, black as midnight, white/bright beneath the jaw, the wolf. He stood on the edge of shadow, legs long and straight, head high. Not approaching, not retreating. Simply being there, as if to underline what had just happened. My heart kicked hard. We hadn't seen each other in a month, yet nothing about him looked uncertain. He glanced once toward the patch of sky where the eagle had disappeared, then back to me. No wag, no whine, no need for motion. Just that steady amber gaze that had shepherded a wounded bird to flight and a wounded man to understanding. A breeze lifted the fur along his shoulders. Gold-green light flickered through spruce branches and flamed across his eyes. Something inside me cracked wider than fear or awe. Some inner door to a room I didn't know existed until he opened it. Every mile of mountain in my ranger days, every note in every field journal, suddenly seemed like small talk next to the conversation happening in that wordless stare. He held it for 3 breaths. Then he turned, so smoothly the grass barely swayed, and melted back into the timber. No crunch of needles, no flash of tail. Just gone. As though the forest had always been missing that one piece and was now complete. I stayed rooted to the porch, evening sliding its long blue shadows past my boots, feeling the earth's slow spin in my bones. A hawk cried far off. Somewhere deeper in the woods a branch snapped, maybe under paw, maybe under hoof. I couldn't tell and didn't need to. The wild had spoken its final sentences. Interpretation was mine to carry from here. I closed my eyes, let the silence settle like dust on a shelf, and felt the truth ring through me. Quiet, unstoppable, perfectly clear. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd never have believed it. But now I know in the wild there is more than strength. There is memory. There is gratitude. There is soul. If your heart is trembling with reverence right now, if you believe animals remember kindness, type, nature is wiser than us.